The outline. Can you just read this? I see the black letters may not be working perfectly here. Can people read that? Reasonably well. So this is the outline of how I wanted to go through the PowerPoint. Basic information on the system, how we see the impacts, limitations on the possibilities for reform, and the kinds of reform ideas. I'm not going into too much detail on the legislation that's before us, although we can talk about it. So here's New York system. The first part of this will be just kind of basic facts. $94,000 is the annual limit that you can give to a party committee in New York, $94,200. That money can be transferred, the entire amount, to the candidates of the political party's choice, and can be used to advance their re-election prospects. $94,200. When I normally give this presentation, I say, how many people make $94,000 a year? But since I'm at the Rockefeller Institute, I won't ask that question. But as you can, when you're thinking about it, it's a lot of money. The second issue here is, really, what are the limits for statewide candidates? And they're quite high. Is this okay? Am I?
Yeah.
Okay. As you can see, nearly $40,000 is the limit. Goal, I think, is what the candidates would say. Limit for statewide candidates, and primary, there's a range depending on the size of the party. $9,500 for state Senate candidates, $3,800 for state assembly, and then for those of you who want to give even more, there's a soft money loophole. And just to show that policymakers have a sense of humor, they call it the housekeeping account, which, of course, visually is somebody changing light bulbs and vacuuming the rug. But in New York, that is an unlimited amount that you can give. In fact, some people give a lot. The mayor of New York City is particularly fond of the housekeeping account. Oversight. You have public access to information through the internet. Currently, you have to report the name, address, contribution size, and date, but that's all. There are whopping fines of as much as $500. And enforcement can only proceed when the Board of Elections agrees on it, a majority vote. And there's two, the membership is split evenly between the two parties. And I'll come back to how great an enforcement vehicle that is later. Here's how New York compares with the rest of the country. We have the highest limits of any state that has limits. There are 5 that have none. The limits are significantly higher than federal. Limits are higher than the national average. 7,700 is the national for gubernatorial candidates at the state level. State Senate, 3,700. State House, 3,400. New York Assembly is close to that. But as you can see, the Senate number is much lower. And of course, statewide it is. And of course, as I mentioned before, housekeeping. So here it is visually to look at the comparison. This is how much you give to the New York State parties, 94,002. Statewide, federal parties, New York State Senate, New York State Assembly, and then federal candidates, President, U.S. Senate, Congress. There's this little guy down here. The basic information on how much was raised. As you can see, $110 million were raised by candidates. Legislative committees raised another $42 million. I'm sorry, 110 was raised total. Parties 42, 69 million from candidates themselves. It was in the 2008 last election. By the way, if I'm going too fast, please let me know. This doesn't come as a surprise to anyone who knows anything about Albany. The legislative majorities raised the most money. The Assembly Democrats, 16 million. Assembly Republicans, 5. Here are the averages over here. As you can see, when you factor in the gigantic advantage the Assembly Democrats have, even when it comes to the average per candidate. It's same thing with Senate Republicans who controlled the House until last year. They significantly outraised, but as you can see, it was getting pretty competitive. And we all know how that turned out. Here is the party committees. As I mentioned before, $94,000 contributions are the party committee limits. And as you can see, again, in 2008, it's crystal clear who the majorities are here. It is the Senate Republicans at 21 million, Senate Democrats at 8, Assembly Democrats 8, Assembly Republicans 3. Who gives? Well, this might come as a surprise to some of you. Businesses give the most. Now, there's a lot more of them. and they're not as organized as unions, 13 million, but they do give the most in the aggregate. Individuals give a lot in the aggregate. You can see the rest here. This doesn't come as a surprise either. Donors are smart. They know who runs the show, and they split their money. 56 million for Republicans, 53 million for Democrats. Now this may be harder to read. How are we doing so far? Is everybody okay with me so far? Can you see this reasonably well? These are basic numbers. I won't go through them in the sake of time, but as you can see, incumbents raised a lot more than challengers. Only 8 candidates who raised more contributions than their opponents lost. Only 8 lost. And then, again, you can read the rest of this here. We just keep moving along. The leaders, the way New York is organized. Did I just lose myself here? Are we? Did you do something different, Michelle? Did I break this? It's still on.
No, you're fine.
Okay. Are you just trying to? Okay. Thank you. In New York, each of the governor has the state party, which he essentially controls. There's another state party for the Republicans in New York. But each of the legislative leaders control their own conference committees, which have a $94,000 contribution limit as well. And that's really where the action is. Most people don't know those things exist. Average people wouldn't know. So who gives? Businesses, unions, basically the people that have business before government. That is the source of the money to the leadership committees, and that's where the largest contributions go. Who are they? For Democrats, the biggest donors tend to be health, the health area, lawyers, and then it drops down from there, real estate, insurance. For Republicans, the top group are real estate, and then it drops down to health. You're going to see the lawyers on there. So it's interesting is it's not dramatically different in who's there. It is different as to who's on top. Health, as you all know, regulated by government, and the health and the unions are very powerful. Developers, they have a loophole they're able to exploit in New York law called LLCs, and they're able to funnel a lot of money into the system. So that's basically who funds the parties. And as you already heard, we didn't do the exact same analysis as Michael did, but you can see an infinitesimally small number of people are listed as individual donors. That's over $99. An infinitesimally small number of people make campaign contributions as individuals in New York. The total number, 42,000 individuals, only 34,000 of them were in New York. But as you know, the state is roughly 19 million people. Not all of them, of course, are over the age of 18. There's roughly 11 million registered voters. 34,000, 35,000 of these individuals reported making donations. So here's where we start to get into now, we start to overlap a little bit with what the small donor analysis that you just saw. In terms of donations, 34% of the donations into the system, these are by individual, right? Individual. By the way, Bill Mahoney is here, who helped me do all this, and Alice Flangley. 34% came from donations that exceeded $10,000. 25% here, and as you see, as you drop down to small donors, under 100, let's just do even under the 200 issue, you're talking roughly 7% of the money from individuals into the system. Very heavily dominated to big donors. New York has a dialing for dollars system, and it really is, in my experience, tied in with the people that have business before the government. Here's another, and if you look at over time, what's happened, again, it's hard to read this stuff necessarily, but here are the percentages. New York has gone even more heavily toward big donors from 2000 to 2008. Small donors have dropped. Big donors come in. Now, some of this is because of gigantic donations that come in from people like with the last name Bloomberg. But nevertheless, there is a shift, a discernible shift from smaller donors to larger donors, even though large donors were giving a lot as it was. Some of that is the cost of campaigning. Some of that is New York's campaign contribution limits have a CPI adjustment, and so the limits keep going up. We used Michael's numbers here, just to give you some comparison with statewide elected and national elected, just to give you some sense. These are, to some extent, apples and oranges, but it's still fruit. You can see here, the federal system relies a lot more, even when you adjust for aggregate. These are aggregated numbers. Even when you look at these, even though only 26% is still a minority, 2% for Spitzer. We have lousy disclosure requirements, in my opinion. We have essentially non-existent enforcement. Every year we review apparent corporate violations, and we're still waiting for action on those things. Part of it is limited resources. Part of it is the gridlock that exists at the State Board of Elections in terms of taking enforcement. This number is kind of a fun one, 1,357 of public officials, candidates who really have 4,500 in outstanding fines. Now, again, one thing I caution you on is just because the Board of Elections says they owe fines doesn't mean they do, which is a whole other issue. But this is what's listed, this fellow named Patterson in 1994. The limits. You can't have contribution limits that are too low. You can't limit the free speech of spending. And so you have a lot of stuff now that's going to, Golisano spent $5 million outside of the system. It doesn't even show up. Public funding, financing can only be voluntary. So these are the things that we talk about. We want lower limits. We want the system to rely on large numbers of small donors, not in height, but in donation capacity, instead of a small number of large donors. Again, not height. We want enhanced disclosures. We want loopholes to be closed, particularly in the area of the LLC loophole. New York considers limited liability corporations as individuals. Go figure. Under New York law, corporate subsidiaries are considered separate corporations for the purposes of campaign contributions. We'd like to see some real enforcement. This is one of the critiques that we would add to yours would be the Assembly bill relies on the State Board of Elections to enforce the public financing proposal that they've advanced. And I don't know how you sell that to the public. No one believes that the State Board of Elections is a vigorous enforcer of the law. And if you're going to start using tax dollars in that system, I think you have to come up with something better than that. We've been pushing very hard to whatever the legislature comes up with, assuming they come up with anything. Since I worked for NIPERB all these years, I'm an optimist. You got to have some sort of new enforcement thing, or you can't sell it to the public that their tax dollars are being used for people running for office and no one's enforcing it. Moreover, from a candidate's perspective, I'm not sure they can even cut the checks to the candidates that opted into the system. So this is a key component for us. And of course, we want this voluntary public financing system. I would just add a couple things. So the prospects. Here's why I'm more optimistic than normal. If we had done this 2 years ago, my comments would be focused in areas of the disclosure improvements and enforcement improvements alone. But now you have the Senate Majority Leader, Smith, you have the Governor, Patterson, you have the Speaker, Silver, all say that they support sweeping, comprehensive campaign finance reform. And it's hard to run away from your own statements. Of course, that doesn't mean it won't happen. And it doesn't mean that they won't have bills that don't match. All of you who watch the Albany scene know that there's lots of ways you can escape the commitment. But this has never happened before, where the leaders of the legislature and the governor have actually said and had bills that they wanted to do something. Now, hopefully they will do something. We'll just add a couple of things. The system is really bad, in our view. It relies on large donors, and it is a pay-to-play system. We're seeing it to our horror with the investigation of the Attorney General's office and the Comptroller's office. That has to change. Our view is a comprehensive package looking along the lines of the ones that I described here. Oops. Doesn't necessarily go backwards when you push back. Oh, you know what you do? You push it this way. No, anyhow, you get my point. Thank you for that. But it is, we want a system, and it has to be a system that relies on small donors. We agree philosophically with the arguments made in the prior presentation. the small donor system is more likely to reflect the interests of the public at large, and that we'd like to have a system that's enforced, that's adequately disclosed to the public so they know what's going on, and we think a voluntary system of public financing would help do that in addition. So that's our overview. Thank you.